On April 30th, 1996, Pepsi made a decision that looked bold, modern, and global. It launched Project Blue, a worldwide rebrand, a new visual identity, a new strategic language, a new attempt to become more like the one company it had chased for nearly a century, Coca-Cola. Pepsi would spend more than $500 million pushing the campaign across advertising, packaging, and global marketing. But the early result was almost invisible. Initial sales figures showed a rise of only 0.1%. The brand that once challenged Coca-Cola with youth, rebellion, and taste tests was suddenly trying to look bigger, broader, and more universal. But here's the part most people missed. This was not just a rebrand. It was a strategic identity shift. And over time, that shift would cost Pepsi something more valuable than one campaign budget. It would cost Pepsi its clarity, because Pepsi did not lose the cola war in one dramatic moment. It lost it slowly by trying to become the thing it was supposed to challenge. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Pepsi used to be. Pepsi was not born as the safe choice. It was born as the challenger. In 1898, pharmacist Caleb Bradham renamed his drink Pepsi Cola. It was cheaper, sweeter, and positioned against an already powerful Coca-Cola. Pepsi did not have Coke's early cultural dominance. It did not own the original image of American refreshment, so it had to find another way in. Pepsi became the alternative, not the official drink of tradition, not the red symbol of nostalgia, not the brand that wanted to belong to everyone. Pepsi became the brand that wanted to belong to the next generation. That challenger logic shaped decades of advertising. In the 1960s, Pepsi pushed the idea of the Pepsi generation. In the 1970s, it ran the Pepsi Challenge, asking consumers to choose by taste instead of loyalty. In the 1980s and 1990s, it attached itself to youth culture, pop stars, music, and celebrity. Coca-Cola owned memory. Pepsi owned momentum. That distinction mattered. By the mid-1990s, Pepsi was still a major force in American soft drinks. Beverage Digest data cited in later reporting shows Pepsi's U.S. soda share reached around 15% in 1995, a high point before its long decline, and PepsiCo itself was far more than cola. By then, PepsiCo had become a large food and beverage corporation built through snacks, restaurants, bottling, and beverages. In 1965, Pepsi-Cola had merged with Frito-Lay, creating a company with a much broader operating base than Coca-Cola. That was PepsiCo's strength, but it was also the beginning of Pepsi's strategic problem. Because Coca-Cola was simple: one emotional center, one iconic product, one dominant color, one global idea. PepsiCo was larger, more diversified, and more complex. That gave the company more revenue streams, but it also made the core Pepsi brand harder to define. For years, Pepsi survived because it knew exactly what it was. It was not Coca-Cola. It was younger, louder, faster, more irreverent. The problem began when Pepsi stopped acting like a challenger and started trying to look like an empire. But by the mid-1990s, the cracks were already forming. The cola war had changed. Coca-Cola was no longer just defending its home market. It was becoming a global machine. Coke had a sharper international system, a stronger bottling network, a more consistent brand identity, and a simpler emotional promise. Wherever Coke went, it carried the same idea: red, classic, universal, timeless. Pepsi had global ambition too, but its identity was harder to export. Youth culture was powerful, but youth culture changed from market to market. Celebrity worked, but celebrity aged. Rebellion sold, but rebellion was difficult to standardize globally, and that created pressure. If Pepsi wanted to compete with Coca-Cola worldwide, it needed more than campaigns. It needed coherence. So leadership saw the problem clearly. Coca-Cola looked unified. Pepsi looked fragmented. Coke had a global visual language. Pepsi had energy, but less consistency. Coke felt iconic. Pepsi felt promotional. By 1997, the US gap was already widening. Coca-Cola held 43.9% of US case sales, while PepsiCo held 30.9%. That was wider than the previous year's gap, when Coke had 43.1% and Pepsi had 31%. The spread was reported as the widest since 1977. That number mattered because Pepsi was no longer just chasing Coke. It was watching Coke pull away. At the same time, the beverage market was changing. Consumers were starting to move beyond traditional cola. Bottled water, sports drinks, teas, juices, and later energy drinks were reshaping the category. The battlefield was getting wider, and Pepsi had to make a choice. Double down on being the challenger, or become more like Coca-Cola. Leadership knew they had to do something. The question was, what? In 1996, Pepsi made its bet. Project Blue. The logic seemed clear. First, Coca-Cola had the stronger global identity. If Pepsi wanted to compete internationally, it needed a more unified visual system. Second, Blue could create distance from Coke's red. A stronger blue identity could make Pepsi instantly recognizable on shelves, cans, trucks, coolers, billboards, and vending machines. Third, Pepsi needed to look bigger, not just like a rebellious youth brand, not just like the fun power came from being Coke. Its brand could be timeless because it had already spent decades building nostalgia. Pepsi's power came from motion. It was the brand of the next thing, the brand of the younger crowd, the brand that asked consumers to reconsider what they thought they knew. So when Pepsi tried to become more iconic, more universal, and more systematized, it weakened the very contrast that had made it dangerous. Strategy rarely fails because the logic is stupid. It fails because the logic is incomplete. Project Blue solved a real problem. Pepsi did need consistency. Pepsi did need global recognition. Pepsi did need a stronger visual system. But the execution created a different problem. It made Pepsi look more like a corporation trying to manufacture a meaning, and less like a challenger creating culture. That is the quiet danger of copying a rival. You may copy the visible system, but miss the invisible source of power. The reaction was not a total disaster. That is what makes the story more interesting. Pepsi did not collapse after Project Blue. PepsiCo did not disappear. The parent company remained powerful, especially because of snacks, food brands, and a broader portfolio. But the cola brand had begun drifting. Project Blue was supposed to sharpen Pepsi's identity. Instead, it exposed the confusion inside it. Was Pepsi the youthful challenger? A global icon? A lifestyle brand? A taste test winner? A music brand? A sports brand? A food pairing brand? A cheaper Coke? A cooler Coke? A different Coke? Over time, the answer kept changing. And in branding, changing the answer too often is dangerous because consumers do not carry your strategy deck in their heads. They carry one simple association. Coke meant classic. Pepsi meant what? That question became harder to answer. By 2011, Coca-Cola still had a major lead in the US carbonated soft drink market, with reporting citing 41.9% for Coca-Cola versus 29.9% for Pepsi. The gap was no longer just historical, it was structural. Coke had defended the emotional center of cola. Pepsi had expanded into many identities. And then, decades after Pepsi's mid-1990s high point, the decline became impossible to ignore. In 2023, Beverage Digest Rankings reported Coca-Cola Classic at 19.2% US soda volume share. Dr. Pepper reached 8.34%. Pepsi stood at 8.31%. Pepsi, once the longtime number 2 soda brand, had been edged out by Dr. Pepper. That was not just a ranking change. It was symbolic, because Pepsi had spent decades fighting Coca-Cola. But the brand that eventually caught it was not Coke. It was Dr. Pepper, a smaller, stranger, more distinctive brand. That matters. Dr. Pepper did not beat Pepsi by becoming Coke. It beat Pepsi by being unmistakably itself. Different flavor, different personality, different cultural lane, and that is the painful irony. Pepsi lost ground, not because it lacked resources. It had money, it had distribution, it had celebrity access, it had global reach, it had one of the strongest corporate parents in consumer goods. But the Pepsi-Cola brand lost focus. In 2025, PepsiCo Beverages North America CEO Ram Krishnan was reported saying the brand had been doing too many things, with communications spread across music, sports, and different messages. That admission explains the long-term consequence better than any single campaign failure. Pepsi did not lose itself because one blue can failed. It lost itself because its identity became too elastic. Every campaign tried to create energy, but fewer campaigns built memory. Every new direction created attention. But attention is not the same as positioning, and positioning is not what you say this quarter. It is what consumers remember after 10 years. What was meant to make Pepsi bigger had instead made it less clear. And in a category built on habit, memory, and emotion, clarity is everything. So what went wrong? It came down to 3 things. Lesson 1, differentiation is not decoration. First, Pepsi confused visual distinction with strategic differentiation. Blue gave Pepsi a stronger visual code, but color alone could not answer the deeper question. Why choose Pepsi? Businesses often confuse brand assets with brand meaning. A logo can be redesigned. A color system can be standardized. A campaign can be launched globally. But differentiation comes from the role a brand plays in the customer's mind. Coca-Cola owned nostalgia. Dr. Pepper owned distinctiveness. Pepsi once owned youthful challenge. The mistake was not using blue. The mistake was believing a new system could replace a sharper identity. Lesson 2, challenger brands should not imitate leaders. Second, Pepsi weakened its challenger advantage by competing too much on Coca-Cola's terms. A market leader wins through consistency. A challenger wins through contrast. Those are different games. When a challenger copies the leader's logic, it gives up the very asymmetry that made it dangerous. Pepsi did not need to become Coke with a different color. It needed to become the strongest possible version of Pepsi. Strategy does not fail because executives lack intelligence. It fails when the organization forgets which game it is playing. Lesson 3, attention is not the same as memory. Third, Pepsi chased cultural moments, but Coke built durable meaning. Music can create attention. Sports can create attention. Celebrity can create attention. But attention fades unless it reinforces the same central idea. Markets do not reward boldness by itself. They reward alignment. Every dollar spent should strengthen the same memory structure. When campaigns point in too many directions, the brand may stay visible, but it becomes harder to remember. And a brand that is hard to remember is easy to replace. On April 30th, 1996, Project Blue looked like a new beginning. A global Pepsi, a bigger Pepsi, a Pepsi ready to fight Coca-Cola on the world stage. But what really happened was this. Pepsi tried to become more like its rival, and in the process, became less like itself. Because in business, one decision rarely kills a company, but one decision can change the direction of a brand. The real cost was not $500 million. It was clarity. And once a brand loses clarity, the market does not wait for it to remember who it is.
So that's it. For more business stories, more hidden patterns, like and subscribe to The Firm Lore. And also, don't forget to let us know your opinions in the comment section.